Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name's Laura Webster. I'm the editor of the National Newspaper, and I'm joined by David Pratt, who is our Foreign Affairs editor at the paper. We did one of these videos about 4 weeks ago, where we were really taking audience questions on the situation in Gaza, and people seemed to really find it quite enlightening and learn quite a bit from an expert in the field. So tonight we're going to be talking about what the biggest global news stories were this year. And we're going to just get started because I know there's tons and tons to get through. And I should probably say welcome, David. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you so much for joining us. I know the readers really value hearing from you. So I'm going to start off by discussing Gaza because there's still just so much happening that people have questions about. So can you give us a bit of an overview of where we are, what's happened since I last spoke to you last month, what the situation is sort of post that brief ceasefire? And Shirley Henderson had asked what the likelihood is of escalation. So if you could give us a bit of an idea of all of that together, that would be great.
Well, since we last spoke, obviously, the Israelis have mounted their huge offensive, not just in the north, but moving into the south of Gaza itself. And that, I think, is going slowly. I don't think it's going as fast as the Israelis quite anticipated, which is a reflection of the problems of urban warfare, which I think we perhaps touched on the last time. So they're finding it fairly tough going, but obviously the numbers, the weaponry is on their side. And in the meantime, of course, yet more civilian casualties. The bombardment has been unrelenting. The humanitarian situation is actually deteriorating quite quickly. Not least, people tend to forget in the Middle East, it gets very chilly and often quite wet in that part of the world at this time of the year. I think people think there's perpetual sunshine in the Middle East. It's far from that. And so the conditions are absolutely horrendous from a humanitarian perspective. The most recent news, and literally reports today, suggest that Hamas leadership is actually beginning to kind of fracture and split a little bit. They're beginning to think about what's happening after the war settles down. And that split between the Hamas leadership in Qatar and obviously the leadership on the ground in Gaza itself. And I think the Palestinians and Hamas in particular are now beginning to think of what is happening in the longer term. And by all accounts, if this report is accurate, mainly through the Wall Street Journal, but there are other media sources reporting it, that they are reaching out to rivals Fatah and others in an attempt to try to come to some kind of construct about how they would run Gaza post-war. But we're not at that political negotiating stage yet. The war is still being fought as we speak. And with regards to the question of escalation, I suppose arguably the war has already escalated. I mean, it's certainly escalated in Gaza because the Israeli offensive is unrelenting, as I say. But it has escalated too, I think, actually, in a wider global sense. I mean, we're seeing, for example, problems with Houthi rebels blocking shipping in the Red Sea, ostensibly in support of the Palestinians in Gaza. We have seen sporadic and continued sort of fighting, or at least bombardment and shelling in Lebanon across the border into Israel. And we still have that tinderbox of the West Bank. So if you'd like to think of those as escalation, all of those things have escalated. But I would probably stick in the caveat that things have not escalated. I suspect this is the question that the reader is asking. The chances of them escalating to a much wider global scale. I think that fear, if you like, has passed for now. That's not to say the danger has gone away, but I think it's passed for the moment. We haven't seen Iran becoming involved. We haven't seen Hezbollah becoming fully involved. So there's a kind of sniping from the sides, and it's still taking its toll, but not the kind of escalation that we perhaps feared initially.
Yeah, that's really interesting, David. Thank you for that. I think something else that's come up this week has been this talk about a sustainable ceasefire. So last time we were speaking, I think it was before the ceasefire, and there were very few senior politicians in the UK, aside from ones in the SNP, who had come forward and actually called for one. We're in a little bit of a different situation now, where some of the politicians are using the language of a ceasefire without necessarily meaning the same thing as a ceasefire. Can you explain what a sustainable ceasefire is and what the difference is between that and what some people are calling like a proper ceasefire, a real ceasefire?
Well, actually, I think it's semantics, to be honest. To explain away what a sustainable ceasefire is, I'm probably just as baffled as anyone else. I think it's called diplo speak. It's a way of actually kicking the can down the street, or kicking stuff into the long grass, to use that metaphor. It's not a real and immediate ceasefire, which is what Gazans need right now, certainly from a humanitarian perspective, to allow the flow of humanitarian aid in. So a sustainable ceasefire is some kind of diplomatic kind of lexicon, if you like, or language that's used to justify, I suppose, a kind of slow coach approach to a ceasefire that allows diplomats, international politicians, to accommodate the thinking of both sides. In theory, that's what the proposal, I think, really means, as opposed to an immediate ceasefire, which could be implemented immediately. But what I actually find really annoying about all of this personally is this constant kind of mantra that somehow the ceasefire can happen immediately if Hamas just simply releases the hostages. Now, we've heard this from numerous political sources, both here in the UK, we've heard it from Israelis, we've heard it from international commentators and politicians and leaders. And I personally think that it's a bit of smoke and mirrors. The idea that somehow if all the hostages were released tomorrow, Israel would give up its military campaign and peace would miraculously descend upon Gaza, I think is a Christmas wish, unfortunately, too far. It's not going to happen, even if those hostages were released, because the express aim of the Israeli government, and particularly those that are really pushing for the elimination of Hamas, is to push that military campaign to its ultimate conclusion. So sustainable ceasefire is really just diplo speak for me. It's a rather meaningless term that leaves things open-ended when what we need is an immediate ceasefire. And even if those hostages are released as we speak, that will not end the current military offensive, in my view.
No, definitely. That really leads us on to a question from one of our readers, Alan Jones, who was asking, it has taken 20,000 dead Palestinians for someone like Rishi Sunak to come forward and say even the word ceasefire. So why has it taken so long for the UK government to speak out about what's going on? We've seen them abstain at these UN votes, and we've seen them really hold back from criticizing what's happening. Why does the UK feel it has to be such an ally to Israel, despite what we can all see happening in Gaza?
Well, I think there's two immediate answers to that, in my view. The immediate answer is that right now the United Kingdom tends to jump or dance to Washington's tune. So in a sense, they're only playing second fiddle to whatever decisions are made in Washington, and the decision in Washington at the moment, or certainly was initially, to give the green light to Israel to pursue its military offensive. And then, of course, the United States started to do a bit of a pivot and begin to sort of say, well, you can go ahead with the military campaign, but try not to kill too many Gazans and Palestinians in the process. So there's lots of double standards there. And I think the UK falls into line behind that. I think there's another historical reason as well, and that is that Israel is perceived by the West as its ally in the Middle East, and historically could do no wrong, except, of course, going back to the days of the British Mandate, when, of course, Israelis were actually fighting British troops on the ground at that time. But that was a long time ago, but it seems to have been forgotten by many people at the moment, And when we talk about banding the world terrorism around, you've got Zionist organizations going back to the 40s and wherever, the Irgun, the Haganah, Lehi, or pejoratively the Stern Gang, as it was known, were all organizations which fought the British and indeed pursued effectively a terrorist campaign into neighboring Egypt and wherever. So, these things have been ongoing for a long time. There's another factor as well, the sympathy factor that Britain and other countries have always had for the state of Israel, given the history of the Jewish diaspora, the Holocaust, the Exodus. And I think there's another reason too. And it's one which I think maybe the questioner alludes to also, which is the level of cognizance or immediate support that comes from the UK, I think in great part is a result of a very intensive lobbying infrastructure that Israel over many, many years now has wielded globally, which obviously includes the United Kingdom, and which has permeated almost every level of our kind of infrastructure, party political level. It influences business, it influences politicians. That intensive lobbying has been going on for decades. So I think the cumulative effect of history, playing second fiddle to the United States foreign policy, the result cumulatively of intense Israeli lobbying over many, many years means that we kind of knee-jerk into position behind whatever comes out from the Israeli government, and that seems to be the position at the moment. But you can see many of these politicians squirming rather uncomfortably as they watch the bombardment in Gaza and the humanitarian situation unfold.
Well, actually, I think just as we're speaking, there's a UN meeting going on about voting on a position of end to violence, and one of our reporters is covering that. So I'll be interested to see what happens. I'll be very disappointed, but ultimately not surprised if the UK decides to abstain again. And I'm sure you've made the point.
In some ways, you're right, Laura. I mean, the abstention thing is perhaps not one of the most cowardly, I think. And, this kind of rather, to use a rather biblical term, and strangely enough, in terms of the Holy Land or unholy land, as some people call it, there's a bit of a Pontius Pilate going on here, a washing of the hands, hopefully that someone else will take up the responsibility morally, politically, diplomatically in that way. And I think it's rather sad and, a terrible indictment of where we are here in terms of our foreign policy, that we continue to wash our hands through abstentions.
I kind of want to go back to the idea of leadership as well. I haven't read your full column for tomorrow yet because I was busy planning this chat just now, but I know that it's something that you've written about in your column for tomorrow, is the idea of leadership in Palestine, and the idea that somebody could emerge to be a really important figure in driving for peace. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that and what people can look forward to reading about tomorrow.
Well, it strikes me that there is a void in leadership, not just in the Palestinian side, although it's glaringly obvious there, but on both sides, frankly. To deal with the Palestinian side first, the polls, and the most recent poll, and I mention this in tomorrow's column, shows that, Palestinians, there's been a massive growth of support for Hamas, sadly, in the West Bank. Now, there's many reasons for that. But one of the most interesting aspects of the poll, which was conducted by Palestinians, by a research institute in Ramallah, in the West Bank itself, was that if there was a two-horse race tomorrow between Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, and Ismail Haniyeh, the head of Hamas, then Hamas and Haniyeh would win. But if it was a three-way horse, and it included a man called Marwan Barghouti, more of that in a second, then Barghouti would beat both of them. Now, that takes me back to Barghouti because he's someone that many listeners or readers perhaps might not be familiar with. And by the way, not to be confused with Mustafa Barghouti, who's head of the Palestinian National Initiative. Marwan Barghouti, a man I managed to interview with great difficulty back in 2001 after numerous attempts, because he was then being hunted by the Israelis who did attempt to assassinate him subsequently, was the leader of the Tanzim, a member of Fatah. He was regarded by the Palestinian street, if I can call it that, by the Shabab, by the youth, as a major figure. He remains prominent and popular, although he is serving 5 life sentences for his political activism and being involved in activities which resulted in the deaths of Israelis. Now, he has often been called the Mandela of the Middle East, and even from prison, he remains a very influential figure all these 20-odd years on. So tomorrow's column is really about how I think we should be looking very closely at Marwan Barghouti, because there is evidence in Barghouti's past, despite his activism, even from jail, that he's capable of unifying different sections of the Palestinian political infrastructure and could be an ideal person as a negotiator across the Palestinian divide. And I think that's given extra relevance given the news coming out of Gaza today about Hamas reaching out to its Fatah rivals. So Marwan Barghouti, very much a person to watch. Whether the Israelis agree with that, of course, he's still perceived to be a terrorist and he's doing these life sentences at the moment. But he is an immensely influential figure. And it's interesting that when, I think it was then Ariel Sharon, who at that time, there were rumors that despite the assassination attempt, the Israelis, in the view of many, allowed Marwan Barghouti to live and preferred to have him in prison because perhaps the day might come where they might need a Mandela-like figure to negotiate a long-term solution. And that may very well be the reason why Marwan Barghouti is still in prison and not dead in that sense, but certainly a person to watch. But equally, in tomorrow's column, I reflect on the fact that Israeli leadership is lacking. There's a kind of leadership coming out of Jerusalem right now from the Israelis, but it's not one that's open to negotiated settlements. And it's not one, frankly, the Israelis themselves, the population, as we know from the demonstrations prior to October the 7th, are keen on. So I think until those leadership voids and issues are addressed, any steps forward will be very limited indeed.
No, that's really interesting, and I really look forward to reading your column tomorrow. So if you're watching and you're interested in that as well, you can pick up a paper tomorrow morning, or you can read David's column online from 5 a.m. If you're up as early as that. Before we move on to other topics, because we do have a bit to get through, we're trying to recap the whole year, which may have been a bit ambitious for us, David, but there's a quick question from June who's asking if you think there might be sort of a domestic political backlash against the Conservatives due to their pro-Israel stance. And I suppose the flip side of what June's saying would be, will Labour suffer? We've already seen a lot of Labour councillors resign over Gaza, etc. I'm just interested to hear your take on that.
Absolutely. I think that backlash has already happened. I think public opinion, by and large, recognizes it's often the way when you have a crisis like this, anywhere in the world. Quite often, it's the public that actually recognize the injustice, recognize the needs for ceasefire, recognize why peace is a much better option. That's not to say that they're kowtowing to the idea of terrorists or terrorism or whatever. I mean, ordinary folk, and I don't even like using that term, but ordinary folk, if I can call it that, recognize that terrorism is abhorrent, objectionable, but equally they recognize when a military campaign like this is ongoing, and ongoing as a result of our own politicians pushing for, or some of our politicians pushing for it, then inevitably that's going to have a backlash. I mean, whether it's reflected at the ballot box come a general election is a different matter, because there are many issues that will impact on that. But I do think that backlash has already happened. It will only intensify the longer our own politicians begin to go against the flow here of, I think, what is increasingly international public opinion, that things are going very askew in Gaza in terms of that military campaign.
Definitely. And I mean, people who are really marching for Palestine here have been so visible in the streets almost every weekend. So it's clearly not an issue that's going to go away.
Well, I don't remember, to be perfectly honest. I mean, having covered that part of the world for going on 4 decades and having lived and spent time there, but I don't remember, almost apart from obviously the Iraq war, which was not the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I don't remember an international response like this. And the impression that you get is that there's been a bubbling away in the background, a growing realization, I think, amongst people across the world about the fundamental injustices that are being perpetrated against the Palestinians, the nature of that apartheid regime that has grown, and that swing to the right that has compounded those problems over the last few years under Netanyahu's coalition government. I think that's been bubbling away in the background. And what we're seeing on the streets of Berlin or Paris or the United States or London or Glasgow, Edinburgh, is, I think, the result of that bubbling away in the background and a greater awareness. There are an awful lot of people who've, if I can use this term, Johnny come latelys to the campaigning side of that. But everyone's welcome, provided they try to understand and realise that there are different sides to this story. But there's certainly a much greater awareness now around than I ever remember about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Certainly. I mean, it was quite a controversial thing, it felt like at the time in the media, for Jeremy Corbyn to be raising the issue.
Absolutely.
And also something I feel like people didn't really understand why he cared so much about it, and now we're hearing so much about it every day. So hopefully,
it was also a subject which, for an awful lot of people, prefer to keep their head below the parapet about, simply because they would be, frankly, targeted as a result. I mean, I mentioned that very powerful lobby early on, they did come looking for people who, if you like, put their heads above the parapet, who spoke openly about what they felt were injustices there. And but that's kind of, I don't know, shirking away from that has gone. I think people are emboldened about it and realise the time has come to speak out. And maybe, just maybe, we're at the moment, despite the horrors that are ongoing, maybe because of that, we are at a point where both sides will be able to step back a little bit from this in the coming months and realise enough is enough, we can't continue, and that a political solution of some kind, thought through, supported properly, is the only way to resolve this.
Let's hope so, because we don't want to see any more violence. I mean, every day that we're reporting on what's going on, and it just gets more and more heartbreaking, and anything that can be done sooner rather than later to prevent another life being lost is very much welcomed. But I want to move on to talk about Ukraine now, because this is been something else that you've written about quite extensively over the last couple of years, David. And while it seems to have dropped off the mainstream agenda a little bit in the last few months with everything that's happening in Israel, Palestine, I'm sure you still have a lot to tell us about what's going on. I mean, you've written some really fascinating pieces about the power that Putin has kind of diminishing, and what's changed in Russia, what's changed in Ukraine. I would be really interested to kind of hear your take on, as we get to the end of the year, what is the situation in Ukraine? What is the situation in Russia?
Okay, but before I immediately address that, can I just say what a terrible indictment it is, actually, in some ways, of our own profession within the global news industry, that we can't actually sustain two international stories at the same time. I mean, we're doing it here, but the fact that Ukraine has, in the eyes of many, dropped off the headlines is quite an indictment, actually, of our inability, our lacking of capacity. I don't mean specifically our newspaper, but in an international sense, to deal with two big international stories. The whole notion of,
David, there's really just you doing our foreign affairs, so I feel like you can get away with it.
But I'm meaning globally. I mean, around the world, it's the same. I mean, whether it's major broadcast networks or whatever, they swap one story for the next, and they don't seem. There was a time where I think they could have addressed both big stories like that and given it the kind of coverage that it deserves. But that's where we are. But in terms of when I look across back, we're going on 2 years since the Russian invasion in 22. And, I've been back and forward to Ukraine regularly during that time and spent a substantial period of time over the course of the last year there. So I've been watching it from the ground, and the changing mood, I think, within Ukraine itself. This time last year, I was actually in in Ukraine. And I remember, with the attack, the Russian attacks on the infrastructure and the electricity supplies and the winter onset and whatever, how the mood of Ukrainians was not despondent, because they're still as dogged and determined as ever to staunch the Russian invasion and push it back. But you could see after a year how surprised they were that the war was still ongoing and that they were where they were. And 2 years on, arguably they're in a much worse place, largely because the supplies of weapons and support that have been continually promised have not been forthcoming. As I was writing last week, Laura, it was a bittersweet week for Ukraine. On the one hand, the financial support from Washington again was log jammed because of internal American politics. Viktor Orban in Hungary helped veto a European aid package worth about 50 billion. So that was the downside. The good news was, of course, that they were being brought partially into the European embrace with an invitation to talks to European accession. So I think they're in a kind of bittersweet moment. But by and large, the main thing are the practical realities of the war at the moment, which has boiled down to a position of attrition. It's a difficult time. They need that military support. They need it rapidly. They needed it yesterday, to be perfectly honest. And what will happen in the spring will be very much determined by whether that support continues from the West, and particularly the Americans continue to deliver the huge quantities of arms and material support that they have. And of course, that is greatly dependent on American internal politics, not just in terms of the congressional debate over the current aid package, but we've got a looming US presidential election. And Joe Biden is very conscious of the fact that, continuing to support Ukraine is not something that many Americans are wanting to do. Pocketbook issues are a big issue for American voters traditionally, so they say, and I suspect that will be the case next year. So I suppose, in a way, Biden is trying desperately, knowing that the Americans have given so much to Ukraine, that they need to continue that support, but is facing this problem domestically at home. Seen from a specifically Ukrainian perspective, I think Zelensky, as we've seen in the last few weeks, has really upped his push and his tour and his diplomatic touring to try and break that logjam, because he knows that next year that is absolutely crucial. In terms of the war on the ground, there's been a little bit of advances to and fro over in the east in Donetsk or whatever, but it pretty much remains as much of a logjam there militarily as it does financially in terms of support in the US Congress.
That's really interesting. And so going into the next election, I've been watching little bits of some of the Republican debates and things. It seems like quite broadly the Republican candidates are not supportive of continuing to give to Ukraine, whether that's aid, whether that's weapons, etc. Who are the most important players in that? Where's Trump standing? Where's everyone standing on that position?
Well, the first thing I would say is, goodness me, change days. There was a time where any Republican potential administration or Republican administration, or indeed Republicans generally, would have been queuing up to stick it to the Russians. Stick it to Moscow. That throughout the Cold War and wherever was very much the kind of mood, if you like, or the prevailing kind of political take that you would get from the grand old party. In terms of the Republicans themselves, I think they are split. They see an opportunity here. I think privately, many of them are not necessarily, in the way that they are publicly denouncing continued American aid. I think privately they know the importance of it, but they see a political opportunity to stick it to Joe Biden and to the Democrats in next year's election, because they know that it's a good vote getter in certain areas. In terms of the actual Republicans themselves, well, Trump remains streets ahead of his other candidates, and he's, despite today's news from Colorado, about the problems that he'll face there, although I think that's just a blip for the time being. I'm sure that'll be circumvented in some way. He remains streets ahead, and his position clearly would be to cut that aid completely, if not dramatically, to Ukraine, probably sidling up to Moscow again, because he's done so in the past, and there's no reason to suspect that he wouldn't do the same again. And a number of other senior Republicans feel the same way. I mean, it's ironic, I think, that Nikki Haley, the former, who used to work for Trump effectively in the Trump administration, was US ambassador to the United Nations, is one of the few senior Republicans who has been making headway, incidentally, in the recent primary debates and whatever. Nothing to really cause a problem for Trump, but she is one of the few who actually openly is still very much supportive of aid to Ukraine. So the Republican ranks, you're right, are split. They see an opportunity to do damage to Biden. But, imagine this from Kiev's perspective. If you were Volodymyr Zelensky and his cabinet, his administration, sitting there, twiddling your thumbs and thinking, God, is our country's future next year dependent on the outcome purely of an American election?
Yeah, that's not the best place to be in for any country, is it? Relying on somebody else like that. But do you think that the sort of foreign affairs big stories of the year, like Gaza, like what's happened in Ukraine, have been the defining news stories for America as well in American politics? Or do you think that there's something else that's kind of stood out in 2023 as a big American story?
No, I think actually foreign policy. I mean, I mentioned earlier that Americans tend to vote with a pocketbook. That's the expression. It's the economics. Stupid, as the old expression goes. And economics still are a massive factor. I think what's happened is that U.S. foreign policy is playing a slightly disproportionate role in the outcome and influence of this coming presidential election in a way that a lot of people did not expect. We've mentioned Ukraine, support for Israel, because obviously that package that's tied up in the US Congress at the moment doesn't just concern Ukraine. It's aid to Israel. It's money, going to a variety of different foreign policy objectives for America. So I think foreign policy has played a much, much bigger part in the American election than anyone could have anticipated. It will all boil down to next November, or this coming November, of course, when Americans go to the polls, and whether these things are vote grabbers or not. But I think they're certainly grabbing votes and attention in a way that could not have been anticipated. In terms of internal politics in America itself, I think there are some purely domestic issues, some of them economic, although the Biden administration, to be fair, is actually, if you look at the number crunching, has not been doing too badly on that score. There are other issues, I think, relationship, for example, to abortion laws and rights, and a whole raft of other issues, migration, borders with Mexico. These things will all have a determinative effect on the election internally. But definitely foreign policy is playing a bigger role than anyone could have anticipated. And Joe Biden is, if anything, arguably, and I use this in quotes, is good at foreign policy. It's one of the areas that, at least historically and in terms of his own political experience, he has plenty of. So they shouldn't come too unstuck. But he's walking a very, very difficult tightrope at the moment.
Yeah, it's really interesting, because when I was in the US in October, I was really curious to see what other news sources there were like. And obviously you hear all of this about Fox News and all these channels. So when I was kind of dipping in and out of these various broadcasters, I found that like a 90% or maybe even higher amount of the news was all about foreign policy, whether that was Ukraine or Israel. And then the rest was about the border with Mexico. And I was quite shocked, because, you would think that there's so much money in American journalism, they would really be focusing on domestic issues. And I don't think I saw any domestic issues at all. And I was there for about 8-9 days. So that really surprised me. And
I think the American press recognized that that these are leverage issues in the election. They will sway voters, and they recognise that both sides, and particularly the Republicans, are going to be using them as leverage and weapons to try and damage the Biden administration. So in a sense, I suppose the American media are kind of forced to look at them in a way as a serious election issue that perhaps in the past they might have been reluctant to do.
Yeah, maybe that's it. But sticking with American politics, I was watching some analysis of the polls yesterday, and there was some discussion of where Biden is now compared to where Obama was when he was trying to go into his second term. And people were saying, well, Obama wasn't doing very well, and with his favorability rankings when he was going into his second election. But actually, Biden's favorability rankings are like significantly worse than Obama's ever were. So I'm quite curious to know what you think Biden and Trump's chances are going into next year.
Well, I mean, if you were looking at it coldly, chillingly, some people might say, then Trump would probably win the election. But I do think as we get closer to that time, I mean, I don't think that either candidate, if you like, I mean, that's working in the assumption that Trump gets the nomination, but it certainly looks that way. I don't think that either candidate is particularly approved by a majority of the American people. I mean, the diehard "Make America Great Again" folk are what they are and will vote for Trump irrespective of pretty much what he does. But I don't think either candidate. I think Americans would welcome a kind of fresh, dare I say, younger. I know there's an issue about age in this, and there's only a few years between them. But I mean, it constantly crops up in the American media. It constantly troubles Biden more than it troubles Trump for some reason, perhaps because of Biden's performances and faux pas, publicly or whatever. But I don't think, for that reason, I don't think Americans are particularly keen on either candidate, but they realize what's at stake. I mean, Biden himself has said that he probably wouldn't be standing were it not for the fact that Trump was standing. He realizes, I think, as many Americans do, the grave potential threat that Trump and his acolytes and supporters, as we've seen from the past with the Capitol insurrection and whatever, they realize there is a grave threat potentially to American democracy here. And if there's one issue which I think that we've mentioned a few that will influence the election, in the background, I think many Americans are conscious of this threat to democracy. Certainly, thinking Americans are in that way. And they'll maybe vote for Biden simply to keep Trump out in that way. They would prefer a younger, more able, shall we say, nimble, if I can put it that way, sort of Democrat candidate. But we have what we have if we're looking at it from a Democrat stance. And I think the Republicans themselves, maybe a bit of realpolitik will kick in there. If the courts don't catch up with Trump, then realpolitik might. And thinking Republicans, I think it's interesting that a lot of the big donors have shifted their allegiances lately to Nikki Haley, even though she's way behind in the polls. There was a substantial tranche of big money moved towards her campaign in the last days, which is maybe just a clue that they're a wee bit terrified about what Trump's re-election might bring.
Well, that's probably going to bring us to the end of our chat about America, though I'm a little bit disheartened that we didn't get a chance to talk about George Santos, because that is probably one of my favorite news stories of the year, is just how wild a human being George Santos is. And I've recently seen that he's now filming cameo videos for people. So it's amazing how far you can fall from grace so quickly. But yeah, I would like to move on to talk about some other crazy politicians, and this time in Argentina. So I think most people will have come across the new Argentinian president just through viral videos on social media. So he's been recently elected, and I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit about what that means for Argentina and what he's planning in the year ahead for the country.
Well, I think two things. One is what he said for his election campaign and what he will do, and we've already seen a bit of a backtracking on that, are perhaps two entirely different things. Um, I think the day after Leo was kind of elected, there was an immediate U-turn. I mean, a lot of the stuff that he spoke about in terms of the economy, in terms of the dollar, a lot of the campaigning that he was absolutely 100% behind, immediately began to have a kind of bucket full of cold water thrown over it by the big world outside. I mean, for example, Argentina's relationship with Brazil. I mean, he was in fiery rhetoric with Lula in Brazil. He's been in fiery rhetoric with China. I mean, and if you look at the actual hard data, the hard facts, Argentina needs Brazil in terms of trade. It needs China agriculturally in terms of trade and exports and whatever. So that cold light of day, when he comes into office, he suddenly has to stop, put down his chainsaw, which was, of course, was his kind of leitmotif prop for the election campaign, and realize that the world that he's entering, the big growing up world of geopolitics, is a lot more complicated than that. I'm actually fascinated by politics in Latin America. I think it's a region that doesn't get anywhere near as much foreign coverage as it should, And if you look back over the last few years, it's been a bit of a roller coaster. Countries that have been moving left, others moving right. We had Bolsonaro in Brazil being ousted. It's a lovely topsy turvy, if I can use the word lovely. Certainly, I'm speaking from a kind of foreign affairs writer's kind of perspective. It's a fascinating topsy turvy kind of region in that way, which is also a massive global powerhouse. I mean, Argentina is a big, big power. We shouldn't be dismissing these countries out of turn. And for that reason, I think that, we're going to see a toning down in office of this latest leader of Argentina. I really do think that's going to be the case. And I think relations with neighboring countries like Brazil are going to improve very quickly. It was interesting. I thought that Trump was the first person to congratulate him in coming into office, because lots of comparisons have been made between him and Trump, and between Bolsonaro and Trump as well. But even Bolsonaro kind of backtracked slightly when he got into office. But I still think there's a rocky road ahead for Argentina, and the Peronists, I think, are just lurking there in the wings, hoping that the new administration makes a bit of a screw up of the whole setup, and they'll be ready to pounce back into play. Fascinating place.
It is. It's really interesting. My best friend is actually traveling through South America this year. That's been her big adventure, and she's sort of found that she's had to change her plans various times just because of like mad political things happening in different countries. So I've been really interested to hear her updates. I want to move on just to talk a little bit more generally, if that's okay, David. We've really touched on quite a lot of places with far right goings on in this chat tonight. And I wonder if you think the world is at risk of going further to the right, particularly Europe in 2024, and what the consequences of that might be.
Well, if you cast an eye across the media at the moment, I mean, I was just reading something, I think it was yesterday. It could have been an Economist, but certainly it was the conclusion that was drawn was that Europe was moving inexorably towards the right. And there's a lot of evidence for that. And if that is true, then those already existing, what would be deemed as fairly right-wing, so the leaders are already causing problems. I've already mentioned Viktor Orban in Hungary, who has an election looming. And Orban is, of course, known for, playing to, his nationalist supporters in Hungary, hence his vetoing of that $50 billion package to Ukraine. You know, that plays very well with Orban's supporters at home. Doesn't go down well with the EU, of course, who see him as I described him, as a burr under the EU saddle at the moment. You know, he's an irritation, a bit of a lone warrior. But Orban is only one of many right-wing leaders that are causing problems at the moment. We have Slovakia recently appointed a right-wing leader as well. And closer to home in Western Europe, you know, we have a number of countries. I mean, Rishi Sunak was just last weekend visiting Israel, you know, and the Brothers of Italy and Giorgio Meloni's party that were running that festival of politics. And my goodness, didn't Rishi Sunak look completely at home, not just in terms of the kind of photojournalism that showed him meeting Meloni, which seemed quite intimate, frankly, in terms of their encounter publicly, but also in terms of the kinds of politics that he was espousing from the lectern and from the speeches that he made. And that common denominator of migration, which is the kind of linchpin issue, I think, which is driving this rise of the right and continues to do so. There's a terrible irony in all this, of course. You know, I mean, if you looked at last Sunday's front pages of certain major London-based newspapers, I thought it was interesting that we had, Rishi Sunak's visit to Italy being highlighted and headlined in terms of migration is something that, you know, is being weaponized by, you know, these countries to destabilize the West on the one hand, and in the other was a headline about David Cameron talking about ceasefires in Gaza and whatever. You know, I mean, I do wish that, you know, people would wake up to the fact that what causes migration, of course, is largely a result of foreign adventures and foreign and military campaigns that we've engaged in ourselves in places like Iraq and Afghanistan over the preceding decades, you know, or other, you know, regimes that we bolster, encourage for economic and rather sort of, shall we say, nefarious reasons to extend their influence there, to basically get what we need from these places, particularly if they have natural resources. You know, I wish people would realize that, and realize that environmental issues are also what causes people to move. You know, when there are droughts, when there are shortages, when crops fail, these are the things that drive migration. It's not the idea that there's some, as Sunak was implying in Italy, that there's a cabal of people sitting around some table somewhere in, I don't know, in Sudan or Ethiopia or wherever, forcing people to come to the West to destabilize it. To shortly answer your question, I think the right is on the rise. I think migration provides them with the ammunition to argue their case, and many people continue to swallow that. And it's something I think we need to be very guarded against. But at the moment, we have a government in this country which is happy to play that card. And frankly, happy as Sunak was last weekend to stand there in Italy and rub shoulders with a party that is frankly a descendant of Mussolini's fascist parties or whatever, a terrifying prospect and something we should all guard. In short, yes, I think we are moving to the right, and it's fueled by fears over migration, some of them completely ill-founded.
Totally. I mean, a lot of what Rishi Sunak was saying, I think if we'd even gone back in time and told ourselves 5 years ago that the Prime Minister of the UK was going to say that kind of thing, I think we would have been really shocked and outraged by that. I mean, it's really similar to the sort of great replacement theory, like that's proper, like hard right, alt-right stuff that was, you know, put out there by really extreme people, especially in the lead up to Trump's win in 2016.
Absolutely.
So it's really worrying to see. But I think
it's the plausibility factor, you know, that we're, you know, people, these things have a habit of creeping up on us. I mean, people talk about, I mean, the word fascist needs to be used very guardedly and very carefully. I think it's bandied around often too readily without a full understanding of what it actually means. But, you know, it's often been said that, you know, that fascism, you know, comes in suits these days. It doesn't necessarily come in jackboots, you know. although there are enough jackboots around to back up the suits, I think, as we've seen in various parts of the world, and it's something that is coming in the back door, it's coming in the side door, it's sometimes coming through the front door. When you look at people like Suella Braverman and the whole Rwanda issue, it's often coming through the front door, but it's coming from all directions, some of them very, very subtly at the moment. And that is a huge, huge issue for us, I think, being guarded against that. Those of us who would want to make sure that the sorts of attendant racism that comes with that and the sorts of issues that invariably and hatred that it stokes up don't come along with it.
Definitely. I think, we're both journalists with the platform, and our responsibility in the situation is just to make sure that we're calling it out when we're seeing it, and we're not burying our heads in the sand when it comes to this kind of far right rhetoric. And I do think I'm so proud of the National in the way that it's been able to fight back against some of those kind of front pages that we're used to seeing from the London newspapers, which demonize the most vulnerable people in the UK and whatnot. But kind of touching on the media there, I'd like to ask you, as someone who's been a foreign affairs journalist for so many years, how safe do you think your profession is now compared to when you started? And what are your biggest concerns about the role of foreign affairs journalists around the world?
I think if you're talking about foreign correspondents on the ground, the dangers have always been attendant. They've always been there. I mean, it goes with the territory, if you like, in that sense. But I think as Gaza has rather starkly and terrifyingly illustrated, journalists pursuing truth, wanting to bear witness, I think are under the kinds of threats that they've never really faced before. They've faced them before, but perhaps not with such an increase, with such an enormous pressure, and in such a widespread scale. I mean, it's not just Gaza, no matter where you look, you only have to read over the rather sad and frightening statistics committed by the Committee to Protect Journalists, or the International Federation of Journalists, or the International Red Cross, and various media monitoring bodies, to know that journalists are being specifically targeted. It's always been the case to some extent, but Gaza has shown, I think, that there is a fear there that when bearing witness is to the forefront of things, it poses a threat to those that are doing things in the world that they don't want the world to see. And it's interesting, we were talking a moment ago about migration, and just pondering foreign affairs as we get to the end of this year and into 2024. Let's not forget there are, and it goes back again to what I was saying about this capacity to juggle more than one international story at a time. Let's not forget that there are other enormous stories happening in the world right now which are not making the headlines. I mean, remember, there was a war, and still is a war going on in Sudan right now. When was the last time we read anything about what's happening in Sudan? It's not that the war has gone away. It's not that atrocities are not being committed. It's not that civilians are not being killed. They are, and in vast quantities, and terrible atrocities being perpetrated. But that's the problem, and has been in covering Africa. Africa's always like somewhere over there. It doesn't really matter to it. It's always had problems, and we're only interested in it when it's supplying the coltan for our tantalum chips that keep our mobile phones and our digital world ticking over, or the stuff that we need to run batteries in our modern age. That's the important thing about Africa. It's not about its people anymore. So wars and situations like what's happening in Sudan, you've mentioned Latin America, there are places there where similar things are going on. These are stories, I think, that we need to pay attention to as well, because they contribute to that overall understanding of what's going on in the world. And journalists in all of these places, not just Gaza, every day, from Latin America to Africa and beyond, to Europe, to the Middle East, are facing increasing problems, because those at the top end who control power and don't want us to see stuff understand that that is the way that the world is made aware of the kinds of criminality, frankly, and injustices that are going on. So it is much more dangerous than it's ever been.
Definitely. And with social media, the power of one video, is incredible. And, on my Instagram, there's all kinds of people who I went to school with, who I went to university with, who maybe aren't particularly engaged in foreign affairs and politics. It's like every day they're sharing these viral clips of what's happening in Gaza. And I think the Israeli government must be aware that, it just takes one person to film something and everyone's seen it and everyone's got an opinion and everyone's outraged. So there's such power in one image, in one short video in the modern age that maybe there wasn't before.
I think there's two things there, Laura. One is that what we're not seeing, both in Gaza and indeed around the world, what is not, even in an age where everyone has a mobile phone, the notion, as we've mentioned before, about so-called citizen journalism, and vital as that is, and the way that enables, stuff to come out that perhaps it wouldn't have in the past. Equally, there's an awful lot of unseen stuff, and and regimes around the world and governments around the world that are not keen on this stuff coming out have de facto engaged with strategies to make sure that it doesn't, and close down areas. I mean, we were talking about Gaza earlier. I mean, there are very, very few independent journalists, other than indigenous Gazans, Gazan Palestinian journalists have gained access to that. Fleeting trips by the BBC or by CNN, largely controlled by the IDF, for example, and inevitably that is extremely controlled and fed through a certain prism. And it is left to other journalists, and albeit some major organizations, but using local journalists in order to do so. So, the world at the moment, we have the means at our disposal, in theory, to gain more information, but it doesn't also allow us necessarily to understand that information. So while your friend might be, our friends might be seeing a video clip from Gaza or from Sudan or from wherever, it's, I think, incumbent upon them to then kind of probe a little bit and find out a little bit about the backdrop to these situations. And I think that's a role that our journalism can play more and more, is not just the reporting, vital in the first instance that is, but analysing and explaining away the backdrop and some of the other parallel kind of concerns and components to what's going on.
Definitely, 100%. Well, we're trying to get more people coming from the National's Instagram to read more and more analysis and comment pieces. And it's a challenge. I mean, these apps are designed so that people just stay on the app. But I think the last few months have shown that there's a huge interest in people wanting to learn more and understand more about what's going on in other parts of the world. And it's often thrown at young people, oh, they don't care about politics, they don't care.
No, I think that's a very, very a very wrong kind of assessment. I think the evidence proves to the contrary in that way. Admittedly, many people kind of knee-jerk in terms of the positioning over it. Hence, I would repeat what I said a moment ago about just digging a little bit of deeper and looking at things in a bit more depth and trying to understand the wider context is vital in that way. And as we move into 2024, I think this coming year we will be as engaged simply through no choice with foreign affairs as we have been in 2023. One would hope that for much more peaceful reasons, but I very much doubt it, frankly, as we move into 2024.
Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight, David, and for recapping some of those stories and giving your kind of analysis on what's coming next year as well. I know we were talking before, we're going to do another one of these in January. So if everyone wants to send their questions in to myself or to David or to comment on the website, it would be great to gather some more questions as we go into the new year. I'm sure we'll have lots more to talk about. The world is never short on news these days, David.
Absolutely. Can I just wish you and my colleagues, and indeed all the readers of the National and people who tune into this stuff, a very Merry Christmas, and we hope we have a peaceful 2024.
Yeah, right back at you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll see you in the new year.